Yeah. Thank you. That was a really lovely introduction. It's I don't know if my talk will live up to that glowing introduction, but thank you so much, Yelena. So I have to say that it's really wonderful to be here at the University of Michigan. This is where I fell in love with linguistics, also with my husband, who I'm still married, but this is where I fell in love with linguistics. And so let me say, this is going to be a talk about intonation, but one of the most formative experiences I had as an undergraduate here in linguistics was I had the privilege to take a phonetics class with Ian Catford. And I have been known to say to audiences not affiliated with the University of Michigan that that was the best learning experience of my entire life from kindergarten through graduate school. And I have had classes with some really fabulous people. But my class with Ian Catford, I think I remember everything because he really engaged the students as learners to use their vocal tract and their auditory systems to learn the material with him. So I just wanted to say I was delighted to be in the Catford conference room this morning and to tip my hat to Professor Catford, wherever he is. In that spirit, oh, why isn't this working? Oh, okay, wait a second, there we go. I'm going to give a talk on intonation, and I'm going to start out with playing some audio files. This is just a warm-up exercise for you all to hear some of the kind of empirical phenomena that I'm really engaged with. And so this is just what you hear. You're going to hear the text of what you hear is Marilyn. Okay, so what I want you to listen to is the other stuff that's not written in the text.
Marilyn.
And it's going in order here.
Marilyn, Marilyn, Marilyn.
Okay, so these are some Pratt screenshots of the pitch contours for those exact recordings. And the question that I would pose, but I'm not going to pause to let you answer it, is what is it that you hear that leads you to interpret the speaker's communicative intention differently in these utterances? How would you go about describing the differences that you heard, for example, to an L2 learner who wants to acquire native-like proficiency in expressing pragmatic meaning in English? What would you say? So these are the questions that we have to ask, and phrased a little bit differently, these are the questions for a theory of intonation. What's the shape of the phrasal contours? And how does intonation function to encode semantic or pragmatic meaning? There are other questions, of course, but these are two of the important questions that I'm concerned with these days. So ideally, these questions would be investigated in tandem with information that flows between the sound and meaning research communities. However, in practice, there's relatively little crosstalk between these research communities. Research in each domain has very complex theories underlying it, different analytic frameworks and methods. But this is now my editorializing. I think research in each domain tends to rely on simplified, essentialized differences in the other domain. And this results in a bottleneck such that important information isn't getting through. So those of us who work on the sound side may spend a lot of time agonizing about the nature of pitch trajectories, but then we simplify, essentialize the meaning to being just asking something. Or on the sound side, and I'm speaking out of school, maybe trivialized or essentialized characterizations of a pitch trajectory as being arise, fall, and arise, but with much more complex proposals, entertaining much more complex proposals about the semantics and the pragmatics. And so I want to just advocate for this rather than this going forward, and I'll come back to this at the very end. So let's take a look at some of the patterns that are observed in English intonation and their described pragmatic functions. So what we have here are some pitch trajectories over sentences, and we can see that there are, or one of the things illustrated here are that there are these pitch movements, we'll call them pitch accents, which are rising, falling pitch on these words new and something. And they can be used for referential meaning to mark focus or other kinds of information structure distinctions. Intonation also conveys the speaker's communicative intention. So for example, the low pitch at the bottom here, this phrase final fall is expressing that the speaker is asserting information. A shallow rise on a phrase final syllable, here a kind of low to a shallow high, can convey speaker uncertainty, while a steeper rise from a low pitch here can convey a question. Okay, so this is just some of the things that people have noticed and talked about in the literature on intonational meaning. The question that I'm asking is, at a most fundamental level, what's the system that generates these patterns associated with these kinds of meaning? What is that system? And we can put this in perspective with other aspects of speech. So we can take, for example, 12 vowels spoken by 45 speakers and plot their spectral properties in 2 dimensions. And we can ask, what's the system that generates this pattern of speech sounds? And the answer to that question is, it's a system of vowel phonemes that encode lexical contrast. That's how we can understand the distribution of these different speech events in this 2-dimensional phonetic space. Not to say there's other additional acoustic dimensions, but just to say that that's the kind of question that I'm asking in a sense. The challenge is that we don't have a firm grasp on an intonational lexicon. So to ask what are the elements of intonation that are associated with meaning distinctions and how do they manifest in the speech signal? Or in other words, what are the phonemes of the intonational system and where in a prosodic phrase do they occur? So these are the questions. Now, the associations between pitch movements and information structure or speech act meaning, which is claimed in the literature, seem to me correct at a very general level of description. But testing them against empirical data requires more precision than our sort of general nod and say, pitch goes up and it's a question, and pitch goes down and it's an assertion. So on the sound side, we need to answer these questions. What intervals of a continuous pitch signal are associated with a particular meaning? What aspects of the dynamic F0 signal encode that function? And what's the memory representation of these F0 features? That's the phonology question. There are similar questions on the meaning side. I'm not a meaning researcher, but I'll throw a few up, and I'm happy to be educated in understanding these better. But for instance, does semantic or pragmatic meaning associate with individual features of intonation or with more complex constructions? And what are the phonological domains in which these meaning distinctions are marked? Are they a single word or a whole phrase? And how are distinctions among types of meaning, for example, types of focus or types of question, expressed in terms of intonation? Okay, so here's a roadmap. In part 1 of this talk, I'm going to present some findings from a series of experiments that test the production and perception of phrase final or nuclear tunes in American English. So I'll tell you about an experiment that asks about which tunes are distinct in speech production, about the memory encoding of tunes, about the possibility of tunes being phonetically enhanced. And then in part 2, I'm going to present a couple of studies that are asking about intonational meaning. So how do listeners associate differences in F0 trajectories with differences, for example, in asking versus telling interpretations, or in licensing scalar inference. Okay, but before we get into these studies, and so I'm going to take you kind of briefly through 5 studies, necessarily just giving you broad outlines and the take-home message that I think is important for building up to my final statement. But before I do any of that, I have to go through a short primer on what's a nuclear tune, because that's a substance of what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so my work is situated in the autosegmental metrical theory of intonational phonology, which is not to say up front that this is in the end the theory that I endorse, but this is my point of departure. In this theory, we have phrasal pitch contours derived from a phonological specification of high and low tone targets. And these tone features are assigned to designated positions in prosodic structure that mark prominence and domain edges. So here we have the prominence, for example, a prominence marking feature, combination of low and high with a star that means this is the accent that's marking prominence, or some low and high features that might be hanging out at the end of the phrase marking the boundary, and they get annotated differently in this annotation practice. So I'm not going to be really concerned with the annotations here, but you'll see a lot of H's and L's coming up. Now, the final pitch accent in a prosodic phrase is also called the nuclear pitch accent. Wait, let me back up a second. So in American English intonation, the pitch pattern in the final region of a prosodic phrase conveys pragmatic meaning. And in this model, the AM model, this pitch pattern is defined by the concatenation of three components: the pitch accent, the phrase accent, and the boundary tone, that are specified in terms of the tonal primitives high and low. This sequence is commonly referred to as the nuclear tune, based on the status of the pitch accent as marking the obligatory phrase level stress, also called the nuclear stress. So pitch is interpolated between successive tonal targets, producing dynamic pitch patterns that extend from the location of the nuclear stress syllable to the end of the phrase. And I'll play you audio files for these simple examples. The text that you'll hear is written up here.
Chairman Madeline. Chairman Madeline.
Okay, and those are actually productions from one of the experiments that I'll be telling you about shortly. So using only the monotonal pitch accents, so the simple high and the simple low, this system generates 8 tunes. And they're shown in this table here. The columns are labeled with the 2 tones that mark the edges of prosodic domains. I call those the edge tones. And there are 4 combinations of high and low phrase accent with high and low boundary tone. The rows are labeled with the pitch accents. And note that for visual simplicity, in this talk, I suppress the diacritics traditionally used, so I'll be representing tunes with these sequences of high and low. The first one is always the pitch accent. There are 12 additional tunes generated using these bitonal pitch accents shown here. So altogether, we have 20 distinct tunes just at the end of a prosodic phrase. This is what the model, this phonological model of American English gives us, is 20 distinct, phonologically distinct tunes. Yet, empirical evidence for 20 distinct tunes is scarce, and I'm being generous to say it's scarce because it just doesn't exist, not in any one study, not in all combinations of studies. There is not empirical evidence that we have a 20-way distinction in the pitch trajectories that speakers of English identify as being different in some way. Especially lacking is evidence from naive speakers or listeners, which is to say those who are not trained in intonational phonology. The question behind the work that I'm presenting here in part 1 concerns the status of these tunes as representing distinct categories in mental representation for which there are systematically distinct acoustic representations. And so now there is some important evidence for the representational status of tunes that comes from work on the association between tunes and pragmatic meaning. However, typically work on intonational meaning considers the system of contrast among no more than a few tunes, oftentimes just one tune. So even though there's some support for the general claim that certain tunes are associated with distinctions in pragmatic meaning, there's not yet a solid empirical support for the claim of a 20-way phonological contrast. I need to move this little zoom when, sorry, okay, sorry. You know that little zoom bar that covers up the texture? Yeah, okay. So we don't have empirical support. So we're taking a different approach here, examining tune distinctions through the lens of memory, asking, do speakers distinguish all 20 of these nuclear tunes, and what is the memory encoding? Now, in this talk, I'm just going to focus on experiments testing distinctions among these 8 basic tunes with the monotonal pitch accents. I have done work on the bitonal pitch accents that very much parallels what I'm going to present here. Feel free to ask me about it later. My first draft of these slides, I had all the experiments here, and my wise PhD student said, yeah, too much, too much. So the question I'm going to address here is, what about these 8 basic nuclear tunes? And I just call them basic because they have the monotonal pitch accents. These look a little more complicated. All right, so we're ready now for part 1, which is work that I did with my former postdoc, Jeremy Steffman, now on the faculty at University of Edinburgh. And our approach uses an imitative speech paradigm. So participants hear 2 or 3 auditory model sentences that have the same resynthesized F0 that represents one of the tunes. We describe these utterances to our participants as being computer-generated speech, and we ask them to help us to better understand speech, the way speech is produced, so that we can improve on this computer generated. And maybe that is some far off goal, but it's not my immediate proximal goal for this research. So they're going to hear something like that. That was resynthesized.
He answered Jeremy.
So they would hear the exact same pitch trajectory on 3 different sentences, where the original recordings were by different speakers, always at least 1 male and 1 female. But since we resynthesized these pitch trajectories, they are in fact identical, adjusted for the natural pitch range of the model speaker. Okay, so then our participants were asked to reproduce the tune they heard on a new sentence in a way that sounds familiar to them. And that was important because we were testing whether the tunes were in the repertoire of our participants. We didn't want to force them to produce things that didn't sound within their repertoire, so we asked them to naturalize if they needed to. Here's one of the imitated productions of the model tunes that you just heard. He did a pretty good job. So the idea is that imitation requires assigning a representation to a heard stimulus, storing that representation in memory, and encoding the same tune in a subsequent production. And from prior work, and as I'll show here, we know that imitation is not simply parroting. Not all properties of the heard stimulus will get imitated, and imitations tend to converge on phonological attractors, which is the reason that I'm using this paradigm here. Okay, so several experiments using this paradigm. I'm going to take you through the first one, which is called experiment 1, but in my lab we call it the basic 8. Okay, so we created stimuli through resynthesizing pitch on naturally produced utterances. The resynthesis was based on these straight line approximations, which are part of the training materials in the Toby annotation system for intonation in American English. So here I'm going to play each resynthesized model tune, starting with HHH in the upper left and going across the top row and then the bottom row from left to right.
She quoted Helena. 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 She quoted Helena.
So participants would hear just one of those tunes on 3 different sentences on a given trial and then be asked to reproduce it. We had 30 remote participants who produced 18 imitated productions of each tune, so 144 trials. So we have a lot of data. The target sentences were always short, and the word carrying the nuclear accent, this tune, was always a trisyllabic name like Helena or Marilyn with initial stress, and it was always at the end of the utterance. And only the nuclear region of each utterance, the name, is shown in these slides. And I'm only going to show throughout the whole talk just the pitch pattern on this nuclear interval. So shown here are the time normalized F0 trajectories from the nuclear region in the imitated tunes from all of our participants. In each panel, the thin lines represent the mean F0 trajectory for that tune from a single participant over their 18 productions of that tune. And the black dashed line is the grand mean for the F0 trajectories aggregated over all the participants. And notice that imitations of some tunes look kind of similar to other tunes, and differ maybe only in a small region of the F0 space. And I want to call your attention to these 2 tunes in the upper left that I call the high rising tunes. And we're going to see that these pattern quite differently from other tunes in our results. Now, the F0 trajectories in the nuclear region were excised, time normalized, meaning we took them all to begin and end at unit time, speaker-centered and scaled, and then submitted to a clustering analysis using an algorithm in R called k-means clustering for longitudinal data. This clustering algorithm selects the optimal clustering solution for these data, determining the number of clusters that best characterize the data, optimizing for having the clusters be not too spread out inside the cluster, but also having good distance between clusters. Each speaker contributed 8 trajectories, 1 for each of the 8 tunes. So there's 240 trajectories that go into this analysis. Clustering was done on unlabeled data, so the tunes weren't labeled for the tune that was intended as the target of imitation. A side note, this clustering analysis is a data-driven method that can be used for discovering similarity classes in acoustic data. It can be used to explore categories in low resource languages for which there's not already a hypothesis about the underlying phonological system. We're using it in the case of a language for which there is a hypothesis, and we're using it to test that hypothesis. Here's the output of the clustering analysis. The optimal clustering solution groups the imitated tunes into only 5 distinct clusters, shown here. This is the same plot of the input trajectories. Just look, that's the same plot. Here they're gray, here they're colored. Each line represents a speaker mean trajectory for one of the 8 imitated tunes, now colored according to the cluster it was assigned to in this clustering solution. And the dark lines represent the mean trajectories for each cluster. So 8 tunes were presented as stimuli for imitation, but imitated production seems to have lost some of the predicted tune distinctions. So which ones were lost? Here we show the correspondence between the tune label of an imitated F0 trajectory, that is to say, what was the label on the stimulus that was heard when the participant imitated it in this way. And we're associating that with the cluster that that particular tune was assigned to. And what we see is that the 2 clusters at the bottom, cluster D and E, the pink one and the green one, light green one, they're comprised mainly of imitations of a single tune, LLL and LHH. Those were actually really reliably imitated just like that without confusion with any other tunes. But the other 3 clusters include imitations of 2 tunes. So this cluster here, this one is an imitation of these 2 tunes. This cluster B, imitation of these 2. They kind of look similar. These are the stimuli. These are the schematics of the stimuli. And this cluster are imitations of these both combined and non-distinct. Notice that the merged tunes, so in these cases, these 2 or these 2 or these 2, all have the same pitch accent. So the distinction between a high pitch accent or a low pitch accent seems to be preserved. And where the confusions are happening is in the continuation of the pitch trajectory after the pitch accent. So the 3 tune pairs that were, we want to take a closer look at the 3 tune pairs that were merged in the clustering solution, and using a GAM, which is a generalized additive mixed model. It's a statistical technique that helps to see differences in curve shapes. We can take a closer look at these tune pairs to see if the predicted distinctions in tune shape are detectable in an analysis where we now identify each imitation with the stimulus, the tone label of the stimulus it was intended. Like this was supposed to imitate a high, low, high. Let's see if imitations of high, low, high differ from imitations of high, low, low when we label them that way. So here are the GAM model predictions that show the mean F0 trajectory for each tune now by color. And the tunes are grouped into 2 panels. On the left are the tunes that start out with the H pitch accent. On the right, the ones that start out with the low. And there are significant differences between tunes where there's no overlap in the shaded regions of these trajectories. But the shaded regions are really wide, and there's that, which tells us that there's a high degree of variability in the imitations of any one of these 8 tunes, most notably for the tune pairs that clustered together. And next, we'll zoom in on the differences for these pairs. So for these pairs of merged, these are the tunes that merged in the clustering analysis. The GAMs show small but significant differences in certain intervals, which are marked by the gray shading, right? So these are the so-called difference GAMs if you've worked with GAMs before. So the paired tunes all differ in the final portion of their F0 trajectories, with one tune that rises to a slightly higher final F0 value than the other paired tune. But this difference wasn't reliable enough or robust enough to support separate clusters in the clustering analysis. Now in panel C, we have the 2 high rising tunes, HHH for high, 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 and HHL. And they show an additional difference in the shape of the rise. HHL is a shallower and domed rise, and HHH is steeper and scooped. Notably, this difference in rise shape was not present in the stimuli that we played for our participants, but I'll tell you now that it shows up in every time we run an experiment like this, and we've now run 13 of these tune imitating experiments, and we get this distinction reliably, which is never given to the participants. So this seems to be a property of the system that we're probing that we didn't know about, but which my colleague John Barnes at Boston University has written about already. If you're interested, he's got some nice things to say about that. So we're going to see this pattern again. Now, when clustering, we also did clustering over data from individual speakers. And when we did that, so we subsetted the data and ran the cluster 30 times, the cluster analysis 30 times. And the analysis returned different solutions across our 30 participants. Okay, maybe no surprise, there's always individual differences. And the imitations were grouped into 2 clusters for some participants and 7 clusters for others. On the left, I'm showing you a histogram that shows the number of speakers for different clustering solutions out of the 30 speakers in our experiment. And the optimal clustering solution for most participants, fully 15 out of the 30, used only 2 clusters. So that means they made only a 2-way distinction, with most of the remaining participants showing 4 or 5 clusters. And on the right, I'm showing you the average shapes of the F0 trajectories in each of the clusters for these 2 cluster speakers. They produce distinctions that look like this. This is really an impoverished distinction relative to the full complex set of distinctions they were asked to imitate. So here's the takeaway from experiment 1. From the 8 distinct tunes that we had as stimuli, all participants reliably reproduced a 2-way distinction between a high-rising tune and a non-rising tune. Within each of these primary tune types, additional distinctions are observed for some participants, and when we aggregate the data over all the participants, where we have at most 5 distinct tunes. The predicted distinctions that are lost in the clustering solution, that means where are the 8 where are the other 3, and essentially, they show up as fine-grained variation of 2 types, either differences in the scaling at the very end of the pitch trajectory or differences in the curvature of an initial rise. I just learned how to do these, so I'm having fun with them in a few places. Okay, experiment 2. So the next 2 experiments use the same paradigm, so I'm going to go through them a little bit more quickly. In this experiment, it's a variation on the basic 8, where we introduced a silent delay between the offset of the last auditory stimulus and presentation of the target sentence, which was again always presented in text. The silent delay was either 2 seconds or 5 seconds, randomly varying from trial to trial. And the purpose of the delay was to diminish the role of information specific to the heard stimulus that is stored in the participant's short-term memory, which is a limited capacity episodic buffer that is described and has been shown to be only holding about 2 seconds worth of speech, 2 or 3 seconds worth of speech, and then it's nothing more. So our goal is to tap into the representation that's abstracted from the auditory stimuli and specified in terms of intonational elements that are part of a long-term memory representation. So we're trying to kind of get past this short-term auditory buffer. We also tested participants with, we tested participants with no delay and with the silent delay that I just described. And in a third condition, which we call vocalized delay, participants had to count aloud by 2s in the delay interval, which was either 2 or 5 seconds. And they had to count by 2s from a number that we displayed on the screen. So every trial was a little bit of a different counting task. It made the experiment more fun, I'm sure. The idea here is that information in the auditory working memory will spontaneously decay within a few seconds, but it can be refreshed and maintained for longer intervals by a process of internal subvocal articulatory rehearsal. We all do this, right? Someone tells you their phone number, and in your head you're just like saying it like without saying it, right? So we don't want that to happen. Suppression of subvocal rehearsal through the it's suppressed through the production or perception of irrelevant speech, degrading the memory for recently heard words and their serial order. So our question is, which tune distinctions will be produced from memory encoding of the heard stimulus when little or no information is coming from the short-term auditory buffer? Okay, so each delay condition had 30 participants for a total of 240 trajectories. This was a big study. And we again used clustering analysis to identify tune distinctions. On the left are the clustering results from the no delay condition. This was a replication of the basic 8. It was exactly the same experiment. Lo and behold, even though I plotted it a little differently, these are dots, these are smooth lines. Hopefully you can see that it's actually the same result from a different set of participants. So that's reassuring. This is what we always want, is a replication. Now, the silent delay results look exactly the same. In fact, they look so much the same that I made my postdoc redo the analysis again to be sure it was actually the right data and not just the same data plotted twice. Okay. But in the vocal delay condition, the imitated tunes are grouped into only 2 clusters. There's a lot more noise in these data. You can see that people were producing, tunes with different shapes, but there was so much variation that only this 2-way distinction emerged as a stable point of distinction in the clustering analysis. For the 2-cluster solution in the vocal delay condition, we can ask which imitations were grouped together in the same cluster, because remember, they heard 8. So we'll start with this green cluster. This is the high rising cluster, and we'll identify each trajectory in that cluster by the tune label of the stimulus it was intended to imitate. So here what we see is that this cluster here consisted of imitations of these 4 tunes. The first 3 listed are monotonically rising tunes. These are trajectories which, even in the stimuli, they start at one point and they just go up from there monotonically. And so that's what's happening here. So they got that. Almost all of the imitations of these were in that cluster. And then we picked up a few imitations of this pattern, which is in the stimuli, it was supposed to sort of start low and have a little rise at the very end, but instead it kind of joins this other pattern with a bigger rise. The second cluster here consists of about 75 to 90% of the imitations of the other 4 tunes, the ones that didn't have this rising shape. And what we see here, it's more heterogeneous, this cluster. They vary in the initial region of the pitch accent. There seems to be 2 things going on here. You either go up at the beginning or you don't, but there wasn't a clear enough distinction in that pattern to emerge as a clustering difference. But all of these end in a mid or low final F0. And that's how this cluster really differs from this one. We also carried out clustering analyses for imitations from individual speakers, and for all 3 conditions, the optimal solution is 2 clusters for at least half of the participants. And in the vocal delay condition, 24 of the 30 participants produced this 2-cluster solution. So once again, we can ask if there are any detectable differences between imitations of tunes that cluster together using GAMS, which is our precision instrument. Clustering is our more coarse-grained instrument. When we label the trajectories for the tune of the stimulus that was being imitated and use difference GAMS to test for significant differences. And what we see is that the regions of significant difference, which are marked here on this 5-cluster solution, are in the ending F0. And we also see differences in the shape of the rise. And this within cluster variation was larger in both regions in this vocal delay condition than in these no delay conditions. Oh yeah, some more pictures. Okay, so once again, so here's the takeaway from this experiment. From 8 distinct tunes as stimuli, we see maximally a 5-way distinction in the no delay and silent delay conditions when participants could, by hypothesis, access the stimulus trace in their auditory buffer. But in the vocal delay condition where the auditory trace was no longer available, the vast majority of participants produce only a 2-way distinction between high rising. Remember, I asked you to look at that on the very first results slide, yeah, and another that has another contour that has an overall falling shape. So in all conditions, the lost tune distinctions can be observed in fine-grained variation in the ending F0 and in rise curvature. Okay, experiment 3. This experiment's going to test only 6 tunes out of the set of 8 that I've been talking about so far. And whereas in experiments 1 and 2, the stimuli were presented on 3-syllable words and participants imitated them on 3-syllable words. And so what we wondered is whether would we see a different pattern of results if they had a little more space for these tunes to manifest? And what would happen if they had like a longer interval, or what would happen if they have a shorter interval? And the reason why we kind of bothered with this is because the implications from the earlier 2 experiments I showed you are pretty serious for the AM model. The AM model says that these different tunes represent different phonological categories. They should be available to speakers of the language. So why weren't they? Do we have the wrong model? So before we leap to that conclusion, we want to make sure the results aren't an artifact of the amount, just of how much material did the speakers have to produce these complicated distinctions. So we asked whether tune distinctions would be enhanced with more syllables for these 3 pairs of tunes, because these were the tune pairs that clustered together in the clustering solution that said there were 5 different clusters. So will differences emerge when they're produced over longer words? Which differences are maintained in shorter words? And these again are schematics of the stimuli, although our participants didn't produce these the same, they produced those the same, and they produced those more or less the same. So in this experiment, we're examining F0 trajectories of these tunes when produced over words with different numbers of syllables. So taking the tune that's produced over 3 syllables as our reference point, we consider what happens when there is less distance between the accented syllable and the phrase boundary. Here I'm showing you a scenario where we get truncation, so the tune is just chopped off in the shorter intervals. But compression and hypoarticulation or undershoot of the F0 excursions are other possible outcomes. And we can also imagine that F0 distinctions between tunes might be enhanced when there's more material. So if we go from 3 syllables to 4, and that those differences might especially show up at the end of the F0 trajectory, where you might recall this was where we saw the loss of distinction was at the end. So the model in this experiment, the model tunes were still represented on a 3-syllable word with initial stress. And in fact, it was the same stimuli that we used in our previous experiments. But now participants had to reproduce the tune on a new sentence, on a new word that had either 1 syllable, 2 syllables with initial stress, 3 syllables with initial stress. And you'll notice here how much we love sonorant consonants. We really did, I think, pretty much exhaust the possibilities of 3-syllable words with 3-syllable names with initial stress that all have sonorant consonants so that we can see the pitch contours. We also tested 4-syllable words. Here it was hard to find names, so we went to these suffixed words, criminally, minimally. And then we also tried 4-syllable words that also have initial stress followed by a secondary stress later in the word to see if that, maybe this secondary stress would be a little support, so provide some scaffolding for a little more pitch distinctions to come through. And here I'm showing you the empirical data measuring the duration of the nuclear interval, just to show you that as the number of syllables increased from 1 to 4, the nuclear interval also got longer. So that means that there was, in fact, more material for these pitch trajectories to be expressed, or less material. Okay. Now I'm going to show you the pitch tracings themselves. It's going to look like these massive tangled spaghetti plots. But before I put that up, I want to orient you to the plot. So it's all going to be in a table format where we've got the 6 different tunes and columns, and then the number of syllables that were in the imitated production in the rows. And this is what it looks like. So these are in real time, raw time. So we haven't time normalized them. And well, you can see that this dashed line is the average duration of all of the tunes in that panel. And you can see that it moves a little to the right, meaning that they're getting a little longer as we get more syllables. And then the different tunes have different shapes, which is reassuring. But also notice that the tune shape going down from the 1-syllable row to the 4B syllable row doesn't change very much. And I thought, because mostly I'm showing in this presentation, the clustering results and the averages. These are the raw data here. I should say these are the raw data after going through our pre-processing step, which cleans F0 trajectories, which are very prone to F0 tracking errors. If you do work with F0, it's really important that you identify and remove bad data before you analyze it. And we have developed a workflow to automate much of that process, which I'm happy to talk to you about outside of this if you're interested. Okay, so what did this look like in clustering? But first of all, we took our F0 trajectories aggregated over all our participants and all the metrical conditions to see what is the optimal clustering solution. Remember, they heard 6 different stimuli, and the clustering solution shows 3. Okay, so cluster A, the red one, is all of the imitations of the two tunes that had merged together in our earlier experiment. So they didn't unmerge here, at least not when the data were aggregated over all these metrical conditions. Cluster B are the two high rising tunes that also were not distinct in our previous experiments, and they're also not distinct here. And cluster C, similarly, these two rising, falling patterns still also clustered together. All right, but these were the data aggregated over all of the different syllable counts. So let's take a look at the clustering solutions for each of the different metrical conditions separately, because that was our real interest. So here we have the clustering solutions for the subset of data where they were imitating the tunes on a 3-syllable word, on a 4-syllable word with 1 stress, and on a 4-syllable word with 2 stresses. No additional clusters came out. We didn't reveal any other distinctions. We still have these tunes merging. Okay, what happened with the short words? Well, in these words, we actually lost a distinction. We now have only a 2-way distinction. And I should have asked you first, what do you think it's going to be, the 2-way distinction? This should start to look familiar to you now. One trajectory, one kind of F0 contour that just goes up and up and up, and another one that is basically going down, but maybe a little up-down happening early in the trajectory. And I'm not reporting here, but it's in the published paper, that we took other measures to look for F0 differences between the tunes that clustered together in each of these different subsets. And there is no further evidence that to support the idea that there's enhancement of contrast in longer materials. Okay, so that's just not happening. So we gave the model its best shot, and we still have to conclude the takeaway from this experiment is that from 6 distinct tunes as stimuli, we see maximally a 3-way distinction when tunes are produced over longer intervals, and no evidence that distinctions between the merged tunes are phonetically enhanced in longer words. In shorter words of 1 or 2 syllables, only 2 distinct patterns emerge in a cluster analysis, the high rising trajectory and then the low falling shape. So a summary from this part of the talk. The autosegmental metrical model for American English predicts 8 distinct tunes with monotonal pitch accents. Evidence from imitated productions shows a primary 2-way tune distinction that is robust across individuals and encoded in long-term memory. A larger set of 5 distinct tunes is available for only some speakers when the stimulus traces are available in the auditory buffer. And additional distinctions don't emerge when we give it a better shot with longer materials. However, the lost tune distinctions do show up as gradient fine-grained variation within each of these primary categories. Okay, so these findings raise questions about intonational meaning. Namely, are there primary and secondary distinctions in pragmatic meaning corresponding to the distinctions that we found between 2 primary tunes, a high rising and a low falling? And does the gradient variation that we observe within these tune categories also license gradient distinctions in pragmatic meaning or distinctions in pragmatic meaning along different meaning dimensions? So now we're at part 2. And in part 2, this is work done with my current PhD student, Thomas Sesterix. And in fact, these are studies that are in part of his PhD thesis. And I'm using some of his slides with his permission here. So first experiment is an experiment asking about listeners' interpretation of questions and insertions and assertions when listening to tunes that are rising and falling. So on a declarative sentence in English, rising intonation conveys a question and falling intonation conveys an assertion. This is a description you run into frequently in the literature on rising declaratives. So we heard some of these at the beginning of the talk. So the rising pitch on the right would encourage an interpretation of this as a question, even though it has a statement, it has declaratives, it has statement syntax. Okay, but what counts as rising is the question that we're asking here. If rising intonation on a declarative sentence encourages an interpretation of a question, what exactly does rising mean? Does it mean something about the starting pitch? So do you have to start low in order to have a rising intonation? Or is it okay if you start high and rise? Is that distinction important? Is the pitch accent distinction important, in other words? as shown here. Maybe this distinction is important. Or does it have to do with the ending pitch? So is it the case that if the trajectory ends high, then it's a rise, and if it doesn't end high, it's not? Or is there some particular combination of the edge tones that signals a rise? So maybe it's just the HH and the HL edge tones, or maybe also the LH, because that also ends high. Or maybe it's the combination of the pitch accent and the edge tone, so it's the slope of that trajectory that matters. Oddly, nobody had really asked this question before, so we took it up and asked, how does variation in the accentual and ending pitch regions affect interpretation along the question assertion dimension? We investigate this with an experiment testing listeners' interpretation of variable falling and rising tunes as asking or telling. So participants listened to declarative utterances with resynthesized pitch contours, and they're asked to judge whether the speaker is asking them something or telling them something. And we tested this ask-tell interpretation with stimuli from a 25-step continuum, varying the pitch accent, varying the F0 of the pitch accent in the starred location there that I just put there. And also varying the location of the ending pitch there. So here, the accentual phrase target is realized, about halfway through the accented word, which was branding. So they're moving the pitch and they reach the target about halfway through that word, and then it moves down in the stimuli. And we're only concerned with the pitch contour over this final word. We held the pitch contour of the preceding material at 90 Hertz flat. Now I'm going to plot the results of our experiment as a bivariate heat map with the accentual pitch, the F0 value of the accentual pitch on the horizontal and the edge pitch on the vertical. So here I'm describing the pitch manipulations of the nuclear tune of the stimuli over the word branning in our stimulus sentence. The pitch accent target varied from low to high, and it's reached at the end of the first syllable, right? So it's reached at the end. So here's bran, and then ning, right? Branning, that. And if we hold the pitch accent, if we hold the ending pitch target constant, we can vary the accentual pitch target in 5 steps from low to high. And we'd get a single row on this heat map, which I'm going to play here from left to right, these 5 steps. Okay, those were 5 steps of that pitch accent continuum, where the peak of the accent is going up a little bit as we go left to right. If we hold the accentual peak constant and raise the ending pitch from low to high, we get another 5 steps on the continuum. We get 1 column here, which I'm going to play the stimuli for you from bottom to top. And notice that the ending pitch is getting higher at each of these, but the pitch accent here, a low, is at the same level on all of these. And we can fill in the rest of the heat map accordingly. And participants heard 5 repetitions of each contour with a different utterance for each repetition for a total of 125 trials. Finally, I'm going to divide these into rising and falling groups based on whether the ending pitch target is higher or lower than the accentual pitch target. If it's higher, it's rising. If it's not higher, it's falling. And then that point is about halfway into the nuclear word. And I'll fill in each cell of the heat map with color, where blue indicates less percent telling response and red is more percent telling. So blue means it was interpreted like asking, and red means it was interpreted like telling. So what are our predictions on how the data might turn out? Well, one possibility is that the question assertion contrast resides solely in the edge tones. And in that case, we would expect to get variation in color along the vertical dimension of this plot. It might be categorical, where these are all like the HH ending tunes, and these are all the LL ending tunes, and in the middle this is the plateau pattern. Or we could get graded variation in between these levels, which is what's sort of indicated on the map by these darker and lighter colors of red or blue. Alternatively, maybe the pitch accent itself is the primary cue to this contrast. And in that case, we would expect to see horizontal gradation, so along the pitch accent dimension. And this you might, if you've thought at all about questions and assertions, you might think, yeah, it's not going to be in the pitch accent, it's going to be what's happening at the end. But there is a literature that claims that an inquisitive interpretation for a rising declarative requires a steep rise. And with a shallower rise, the interpretation is less inquisitive and more likely to be inferring something about politeness or something else. So this is a paper by Zhang in the Journal of Semantics in 2018, making this claim that we're testing here. A third possibility is that both the pitch accent and the edge tones contribute, and then our data results might look something like this. Here are the actual results from 52 participants recruited on Prolific. The schematic of these results look closest to is the top one, which is supported by our statistical model. The ending pitch is what matters, is what predicts the interpretation of these patterns. The accentual pitch didn't contribute to predicting the responses, nor was there an interaction between the accentual pitch and the ending pitch. So the takeaway from this experiment is that variation in the ending pitch, which is controlled by hypothesis by the edge tones in the model, predicts the listener's interpretation of these trajectories as asking something or telling something. And we do acknowledge that there are a few trajectories that have a relatively flat shape, that's sort of a more plateau ending, that seem to be ambiguous between that. There's slight gradation in the response patterns only for the rises. So these have are more likely to be interpreted as asking, and these are slightly less likely, but still not really, we're not really getting a gradation from top to bottom. And not really any differences in the falling trajectories. That if you're a fall, however steep, however far, it's interpreted as telling in this experiment. Now, there may be other dimensions of meaning that listeners are detecting from variation within these rise and fall categories. Thomas has looked at this and has some results to share, which I'm not presenting here. The last experiment that I will go through is an experiment that looks at the rise, fall, rise intonation pattern in English and interpretations of scalar inference. And this contour really, along with rising declaratives, receives the most attention in the literature on intonational meaning, mainly people writing about it from semantics and pragmatics perspectives. So and here's an example of a rise, fall, rise. So we got this, no, I didn't, okay. We get a rise in the accented syllable, and then it falls, and then it rises again. And in the literature on the meaning of these, there's a lot of different opinions about what this contour means. But they seem to all sort of converge on something to do with alternative interpretations of the proposition, and especially with alternatives which are higher on some scale. So to probe this, we're going to use tasks of scalar inference, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. So if we take a sentence like Jane ate some of the cookies, then so some is a term which with all is a lexical scale. So all is the lexical scale mate from some. And what we get when we pair a sentence like this with, when we pair a sentence like this with a rising, falling trajectory is an interpretation which invokes the scale mate, the higher alternative, with uncertainty. Like if you say, Jane ate some of the cookies, it means you might be uncertain about whether she ate all of the cookies, or maybe explicitly negating the higher scale mate. These are competing claims in the literature. The question that we're asking is, what tunes count as rise, fall, rise? And is it the case that the disagreements in the literature on the meaning of rise, fall, rise might come about because they're actually talking about different tunes? Maybe there's 3 different rise, fall, rises, and they have different meaning functions. This was our question. Now, American English has 3 different rising pitch accents, each of which could be involved in a rise, fall, rise contour. The H star is a shallow rise to an early peak. the L plus H star is a steep rise to an early peak, and the L star plus H is a steep rise to a late peak. And we want to know whether all of these equally facilitate a scalar inference. So we compare the scalar inference with the rise, fall, rise tunes to scalar inference with when the tune is just a falling contour. Falling contours are also okay on those sentences. Like you could say, Jane ate some of the cookies with a falling contour. It's not incongruous or infelicitous, but the claim is that it doesn't encourage the scalar inference in the same way that the rise, fall, rise contour does. So let's run through our inference task setup. So our participants are going to hear a sentence like, the office feels cool. And they're going to be asked whether they conclude that the office does not feel cold. So we're asking them if they made the scalar inference and negated the higher scale mate, if they interpreted the sentence that way. And we ask that question when cool has a rise, fall, rise contour, and also when cool has just a falling contour. Now, rise, fall, rise is a special tune in English that can't be used out of the blue. Like you can't, the first thing you say to somebody can't be, hey, Elena, the office feels cool. That's weird. It requires some context. So we gave them some context preceding the auditory stimulus. Here, did someone leave a window open in the office overnight? The office feels cool. Okay, now that's supported. These contexts, we were careful that they were actually normed first to make sure that they weren't biased towards or against a scalar inference. And we use 64 adjectival scales like cool, cold, strenuous, difficult, that had also been normed for scalar inference. Lots of norming work. And then the audio materials that we resynthesized, we had 3 different rise, fall, rise tunes that were made with the 3 different kinds of rising pitch accents in English that have been proposed for English. We had 3 different falling contours with those same 3 pitch accents. We ran our experiment with 83 participants on Prolific. And I'm just reminding you over here of what the task was. And these are the results that show on the y-axis the average rate of scalar inference. That means the average number of times that the respondents said yes when the tune they heard was a falling contour compared to when it was any one of these 3 rising rise, fall, rise contours. So the rise, fall, rises are generally higher on this scale than the falls, which means that they encourage scalar inference far above the rate that you would otherwise get. So the participants were more likely to infer that the office was not cold when this was produced with, cool was produced with rise, fall, rise. So the office feels cool. Yeah, it means it wasn't cold versus the office feels cool. The speaker meant that it wasn't cold. Okay, so that was a very robust difference. However, we also note that there are graded distinctions in the scalar inference rate across the 3 different rising pitch accents. And the accent that has higher prominence here, the one that's low star high, has the highest SI rate. So the takeaway for us is that based on scalar inference, there's a robust distinction between the rise, fall, rise trajectory and the falling tunes. But there's also graded distinctions in the SI rate among the rise, fall, rise tunes that had different pitch accents. So what it suggests to us is that the type of the rising accent, the type of the rising accent kind of, in one sense, doesn't matter because you're going to get scalar inference anyways, but you're going to get it more if you use a more prominent pitch accent. So this suggests to us that there's this distinction in pitch accent type is a within category variation. And here are the 2 categories of tunes. And then the difference between these 3 versions of the rise, fall, rise is just a degree difference. Okay, I will call out one other thing. If you, this is a Friday at 5:15, almost right before your fall break week. So I would understand if you didn't catch this, but full disclosure, the difference between rise, and fall is a difference in these edge tones, LH versus LL. And you might remember that from our imitation experiments, this distinction was never imitated. These would all have been treated like one big superclass tune. And yet in the rise, fall, rise experiment, this distinction is actually kind of super important. So what's happening there? Well, in our imitation experiments, we were trying to elicit productions with no context. Here, we gave them a very supporting context and we created the melody and they just had to interpret it. So it looks like this distinction actually is available, but it's kind of sensitive and brittle, unlike the more robust distinctions that came through in our imitation work. So a wrap up here. Well, considering our production work on using the imitation paradigm and the two studies where we're probing listeners' interpretation, what we see, this is my interpretation of the findings, is that we have evidence for two primary categories, high rising and low falling, which are robust across speakers. And I didn't tell you about the experiments that we did testing listeners' ability to discriminate among these tunes in an AX discrimination paradigm. But those results line up perfectly with our clustering analyses. Happy to talk about those later with anyone who's interested. So this primary category distinction is robust across speakers. It's encoded in memory. And it's not dependent on context. So when we did the asking telling experiment with falls and rises, our participants in that experiment didn't need any discourse support to interpret an utterance as asking or telling. They categorically interpreted rises as asking, falls as telling, nearly categorically on the rises. And then we have this secondary level of categories, which are, we got maybe up to 5 of them. They seem to be variable across speakers, also listeners. They're not reliably encoded in memory, and they seem to depend on context. And that was what we saw from our rise, fall, rise experiment. One of these patterns, the rise, fall, rise pattern, was available, but it needed that supporting context. And then we also have fine-grained variation, which is within category, gradient variation in form that's associated with variation in meaning. And we saw that in a little bit of the edge tone scaling effect with rises for the ask-tell experiment, and the little gradation in rise, fall, rise in scalar inference rates with rise, fall, rise that depended on the shape of the rising accent. This distinction that we also saw coming out in our GAM analyses of our production data. And I'm going to end here with a quote from Bob Ladd, who's a giant in the world of intonation research, who said in this 2022 paper that, he's kind of schooling us all to pay more attention and saying, kind of like Professor Catford, pay more attention. Phonetically gradient variability has the potential to signal pragmatic nuances that seem quite distinct. And then he kind of left it there. And I'm like, yes. But to get a better handle on that, Bob and everybody else, we need more of this kind of research to take away the bottleneck, to think about intonation in terms of the phonology, also paying a lot of attention to the phonetic detail, thinking about the meaning, not in an essentialized way, but taking full advantage of the rich theories of meaning that are developed largely based on analysis of text and intuition, rarely engaging with spoken language. So we just need to remove the bottleneck. And that's sort of a plea to any of you out there on the meaning side. Come talk to people on the sound side, and to people on the sound side to, come out of your labs and go and search out people on the meaning side, because I think we have a lot more to learn. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really exciting and very rigorous and great. I wanted to talk a bit about the rise, fall, rise, which is, to me, it seems very complicated and confusing, and about the kind of landscape of pragmatic meaning there. I guess to me, most readily when I think about this scalar inference of the rise, fall, rise, I think about expressing like incredulity at something someone else has said, like cool, it's not cool. But I think of that as being able to express either extreme of it could be actually I think that it's hot or I think that it's cold. And I wonder how your design is sort of getting around that, or if you agree in the first place, or if you think, you know, there's clearly a lot of you were talking about the nuance of phonetic variation being able to express these fine-grained pragmatic meanings, and maybe there's some rich stuff there yet to be captured that could even access, you know, some of the directionality of that.
So I mean, at first I say that I'm not a pragmatician. I think that ultimately, so certainly in the literature, people have reported this as a characterization, described this as characterization of rise, fall, rise, that it expresses incredulity. In fact, one of the few published papers that actually talks about the sound is the Ward and Hirschberg 1985 and paper, and they say it's incredulity, but they don't test it empirically. So ultimately, this is an empirical question. Is there an incredulity interpretation that's different than that is there an incredulity interpretation? Probably, although people have said that that also is a scalar inference. It's just the scale is whether this is relevant to the QUD, the question under discussion. So the notion of scale doesn't have to be lexical scale mate. It could also be a larger, in a pragmatic context, scale. Or how prototypical is this? So it could be a prototypicality scale. Ultimately, all of this has to be tested with experiments that ask participants those questions instead of probing with scalar inference, which is what we probed with. I will say, though, that Thomas's work, this is Thomas Sesterik's, he also has done experiments with cross-modal priming using our rise, fall, rise to see if, you know, hearing a prime with rise, fall, rise evokes the alternative, and then do you recognize the scale mate of the alternative faster than some other semantically related word? And he finds, yes, he finds support for this analysis there, but he also finds some interesting different patterns that seem to suggest that the rising pitch accent that is often described as the focus marking pitch accent, so L plus H star, which has that higher peak and steeper rise, slows down the reaction to the higher scale mate. It should do the opposite. He has a discussion of that where it could be that there's a focus interpretation that's coming online, which is sort of orthogonal to the scalar inference, and so you get a slowdown. But yeah, just to say, this is complicated stuff, and there's more than one meaning dimension that could be activated by a particular tune. But to get at it, we need to like take the tunes kind of seriously, and also think about experiments that probe dimensions of meaning independently. So it's a good question. Maybe you'll do that experiment.
I'm not a pragmatic person either, but
I was either. Yeah. However, I do know you got to talk to pragmaticists if you're not a card-carrying pragmaticist. That works. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I want to preface, I'm a neurolinguist. I don't really work with prosody, so, but you made it very accessible, and I really appreciate that. My question, and so I preface that because I was wondering whether the model is also on a lexical level, because I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, your experiments are also focused on a lexical level of pitch accent. Is that right? And so
Yeah, the imitation yes, all of our experiments that I shared with you today are looking at pitch happening on a word.
yeah.
And you're right to question whether is that enough?
I was
If that's
thinking
your
about
question.
it. I was curious as to whether the model has so many tunes because it might be wanting to capture phrases, and but then I was thinking, do you know, are phrasal tunes a thing, or is it really captured by, you know, each word has its
Yeah,
own
I can answer this
you
question.
know?
So the model captures the pitch trajectory at the end of a phrase, which is where meaning is conveyed through intonation, which isn't to say that there's no pitch happening in the early part of the phrase, but my work, especially also some work of other people, shows that pitch modulations on words that come before that critical ending actually don't encode
see.
referential meaning.
I see.
What they do probably encode is the speaker's overall level of arousal, their intention to engage the audience. So I probably got a lot of pitch accents when I'm speaking up here on this stage, and just sitting close to Yelena talking in her office, probably fewer of those.
Yeah.
So the model is a model of what can happen in that meaningful portion of the phrase, which is usually on one word, but which can be over more than one word if the last stressed word in the phrase comes a little earlier. But in English, that only happens when you have narrow focus or contrastive focus on a word that doesn't happen to be the last word in the phrase,
I see.
which you can do in English, but not in most other languages. And in that case, you can have this whole phrasal pitch pattern that I was describing here on in my lab, we've looked at 6 syllables, 7 syllables, 8 syllables, up to 2 words, 3 words, and you still see the same pattern. So it's not really about what's happening on a word, it's about what's happening in this interval that the language has said, this is where it happens.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for clarifying. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This was really interesting. I was just wondering whether you think that there could be any interference in your imitation experiments from the participants' interpretations of the no context sentences.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, this is a really good question. So we don't provide them with context. We just say, here's what it sounds like. Now you produce this on a new sentence. But we know, we think that these different contours are conveying different kind of types of pragmatic meaning, and we haven't given them any discourse context to support it. So maybe if they had a discourse context, maybe some of the missing distinctions would come out. We tested that, but I didn't have time to show you those results. It makes zero difference. This really surprised me. It really didn't make a difference in the imitation paradigm. We gave them like a little discourse context. We call them stage notes. And then they hear the melody they're supposed to imitate, and then they got to imitate it. We still get this exactly the same pattern of results. So I'm not to say maybe we didn't write our discourse context quite well enough, and maybe some other richer set of discourse or just better scripted would succeed. So this isn't the last word. But I will say that some tunes seem not to really need that. That's at the very minimum, we can say that.
yeah, I mean, the two main ones that you kind of highlighted, the rising and falling primary, what was the term that you used?
A primary distinction.
Primary
Yeah.
distinctions, statement versus question, those seem pretty natural out
Yeah.
of the blue. But do people have different interpretations for all 8 of the possibilities?
It's been claimed, but there's in the literature, there's one paper by Pierre Humbert and Hirschberg in 1990 that goes through the full model and makes proposals about what each one would mean compositionally. They're advocating for a compositional theory of meaning. It has never been empirically tested. In part, I wanted to try to test that. But yeah. So I should also clarify that the phonological model could be correct, and yet it could be that not all of those 20 tunes are instantiated in the language, and those are just the primitives that are available for use. And that's also possible, but our results don't really lend a lot of support that the tunes that weren't imitated are available. Maybe they are, but I'm just saying under this context, we get a clear difference between the tunes that are accessible, available, and reproducible, and others that seem not to be in this type of task. So it's, again, not closing the door on the future, but at the very minimum, making a distinction. And here, just also make an analogy. So you all, as speakers of English, we know the phonemes of English, the consonants and vowels that can be used to differentiate word meaning. And we can combine them in different ways to make different words. But the lexicon of English doesn't exhaust all the ways that those building blocks can be combined. And yet if I give you a combination of consonants and vowels that's not a word of English, like gib, and ask you to say it back to me, you can't. And that's not even hard. And accuracy is going to be near ceiling there. So on analogy with that, something different seems to be going on here.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Very, very interesting. I have a question about the conclusions at the end of part 1. Just for clarification, you said that what matters is what the tone is at the end of the utterance. Yeah, 76, 77, I think was where it was. Is what's important the tone at the end, or is it the movement between the previous point, so the medial point and the end point?
Right. So the slope varies on these because when the pitch accent point is very low and the ending point is very high, we control the interval between them, so you get something very steep, much shallower here, but not a systematically. There's variation, but it's not systematically predictable from the slope. Yeah, we tested that model too. We also tested a model where we looked at the center of gravity of the pitch movement to see if that predicts a response. That does help. But most, the gorilla here is the ending F0. That's the strong predictor.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
My question's about this, so this is perfect. So I'm wondering, your response for this one. By the way, first of all, thank you so much for a great talk. This was awesome. So so fun to hear. And you did such a great job showing us so many different plots in a way that was understandable. So thank you. So for this finding in particular, you had is asking or telling. So it's a categorical response.
Mhm.
I'm sure you've already heard this question before. So I'm curious, if you had some sort of slider scale of like how ASCII, how telly, do you think, the thing about that is you could still get a categorical
Mhm.
like outcome, right? So I'm curious if you
Mhm.
have tried that or if you think it's worth it, particularly with 52 participants. I'm curious, might be relevant. Yeah.
So we ran this experiment again with a third response option, which was called other. And then we asked participants if they marked other at the end of the experiment. The experiment was script coded in such a way that trials on which they responded other were presented to them again for a free text response for them to tell us, what did you hear if it wasn't asking or telling? And then we did some NLP on the free text responses to pull out semantic concepts. And this is something that Thomas likes to do in his spare time. And the themes that seem to come through had to do with, we're not really prepared to talk about this. Yeah, I think it was surprise or something focus related. So we do have evidence that for when we gave them a third response option, there were some other meaning distinctions that people were sensitive to, but also that other response option was only taken about 15% of the responses of the trials. So there was a lot of accommodation to the asking telling response. But of course, it's possible to run the experiment under different conditions, and it would be a good idea to do that.
Well, I guess my sort of follow-up to that would be, right, if you had something, because here you see a little bit of gradation in the asking,
Yeah.
right? But you don't see it
In the falling.
but maybe like if you didn't find it or you found it still in the same way, but to a lesser extent when there was, if there's a more continuous scale, that would be kind of interesting. I guess not finding it would be interesting potentially as well.
Yeah.
You could not find it if you did
Yeah.
it that way, but this way you can't not find it, right?
I agree. Another thing I would be interested in, but I don't think that that Thomas is going to have time to do it, is to run the experiment. You might have noticed it was a male voice was his voice, to run it with a female voice, because the interpretation of upward trending pitch on a female voice as asking or telling might be very different from a male voice. Although recent research at, not my student, but at Northwestern shows that responses to male and female uptalk is actually the same.
Mhm.
But, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to second what Savi said about the graphs there. Great, and I really appreciated the readability as well. I was wondering if the productions that they produced of the tunes changed at all over like the not time, but like number of productions. So if they had produced, each tune like once, was that different from the 8th time at all? And maybe I know they were probably randomized, but
They were, yeah. That's a really good question, and we haven't looked at that in all of the iterations on the imitation experiment. We haven't looked at growth over of a particular tune, a sort of growth of the trajectories. It would be a good thing to look at.
I was thinking about this because in an AGL study I was running, the participants continued to grow to a certain point and then sort of flattened out. And this is not AGL, but I was wondering if they would eventually, like maybe they started out with more categories and reduced, or maybe nothing changes. I don't know.
That could be.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I think we have the trial number information, so we could go back, and we have a lot of data, so we could go back and look at that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that was a really lovely talk. So I've been thinking about what are my prototypes for prosody, meaning matching, made of. And I have this intuition that it's not just pitch, but it's other prosodic variables as well. And I wonder to what extent you think that's true, and if that makes some of your stimuli sort of feel impoverished to your participants.
Yeah, I share that concern. So when, in natural productions, when pitch is going up or going down, there are oftentimes, and certainly in American English, voice quality distinctions that vary along with that, which, as far as we know, our resynthesis technology doesn't allow us to control that and to change it. Pam, if you know otherwise, you can tell me, but I don't think so. So it's probably the case. Now, one thing that I mentioned now that we've done a lot of iterations on this, one of the iterations is that instead of using our resynthesized stimuli, we had one version of the experiment where we paid voice actors to imitate the same stimuli that our subject pool and prolific participants imitated, thinking like the voice actors will get it, and we gave them a discourse context, like this is what was happening, and then they said that, and then say this with this tune. And they were more expressive. They didn't actually get more distinctions, but they were very lovely. Their voices are so lovely. Because they're voice actors, right? They're paid to lend their voice to things. Then we use those as stimuli for imitation in the experiment, thinking like, okay, now there's richer voice quality and more expressiveness, and these aren't Frankensteins. The results were exactly the same. I mean, I've run this experiment so many times, and that 5 contour result, it's always those, I mean, like, I'm not an evangelist here, but it is a fact that we just keep getting that result. So I'm now bored with it, and I don't want to run any more experiments that return back these 5 tunes. Like, I already know. But we did try it we tried it twice, once with the voice actors and once with just our normal participants. We took the ones who in the individual clustering, they got 7. That was the best. We took them, used their materials, there were 2, a male and a female, fortunately, and used their materials.
That's so fascinating.
I think that's time, right? Yeah.
It's a great talk. I'm not a phonetician. A lot of it I couldn't follow, but fascinating, your work. And I'm curious about this from a very external perspective of a second language speaker of English. And intonation in second language is one of the hardest things to learn and to teach. Yep. And so my question to you is, what is your sort of a way your takeaway message to someone who's learning a second language and looking at English as a second language in terms of what is the main thing that they need to worry about?
I mean, that's probably the most important question here, that and also like clinical applications or applications with hearing loss. But I don't teach English as a second language, so I feel in a weak position to answer that. But I would say the rising falling distinction, you should probably get that. And that, but I don't think that's hard for people. And I would say, don't worry so much about the others, because it turns out English speakers are not always consistent on those anyways. And I think there's a lot of secondary cues coming out through gesture. I know I do a lot with eyebrows. My students tell me, boy, your eyebrows are really busy. And yeah, that's probably what I would say. And there's emotion being conveyed through the same channel. And I think that that is accessible across to some degree across language differences, as long as the culture is familiar. So my takeaway would be, don't sweat the little stuff, get the big thing. But I'm not a second language teacher.
Thank you.